Welcome back to the Politics with Paul podcast with your host, Paul Rader. We inch ever closer to Election Day, and today we're going to talk about key U.S. Senate races. Now, last episode, I talked about a bunch of aspects we consider when looking at whether an election is competitive. We don't have time to go over all of those factors for every race, but we can look at some of the most important ones. Not every factor I talk about here will necessarily be competitive for each of these races. It's like in some cases, for example, campaign spending will be vastly favoring one candidate over the other. But today we're just focusing on competitive U.S. Senate races. Those will take up a lot of time to go over. U.S. House, governor, and state legislative chamber control will be later on this week. And then, of course, we will have the presidential race. But first, let's get into the U.S. Senate elections. So, again, some of the facets I'm going to use, I highlighted in previous episodes, and just to give a quick rundown of a little bit of what we talked about with those previously. So, open seat versus incumbent. Generally speaking, if it's an open seat, it'll be a little bit more competitive. Incumbents often have the advantage of being an incumbent because they are already known and they already have connections and money. Electoral history, if the seat has a history of being very competitive or it's become increasingly competitive, we take that into account. Concurrency with other elections, namely if it's expected to be a competitive state for president. Not every one of these U.S. Senate races is expected to be a competitive state for president as well. But obviously there will be a few where both the U.S. Senate race and the presidential race in that state are expected to be competitive. Campaign spending, a lot of this will mostly be as of September 30th, 2024, because campaign spending has specific periods of reporting where the campaigns file their paperwork. We'll also be talking about independent expenditures. Those are those quote-unquote dark money groups that are not affiliated with these campaigns, but they spend a lot of money in support or opposition of these campaigns. They can spend and raise unlimited amounts of money as long as they do not coordinate with these campaigns. And generally speaking, there's a lot more spending in these competitive races by the Democratic campaign committees versus those for Republicans. But some of these races are still very competitive, so can't just assume just because there's a lot more spending by one campaign committee that means that they're well ahead. That's not necessarily the case. Voter registration numbers by party, if a state tracks that. Remember, not every state tracks the party affiliation of voters. Some of them just register voters as eligible to vote or as registered to vote. And that's it. Latest polling is going to be a brief look at polling numbers, and I'm going to use them as supplements. They are not the be-all, end-all, or end-all, be-all, however you say that phrase. These are just used as supplements. A lot of times polling gets eviscerated for being quote-unquote wrong, and sometimes they're off. It's not that polls are infallible. They're not. But a lot of people don't really know how to appropriately use them. So just keep that in mind. These are supplements. They are not just, oh, this is definitely who's winning this election. And then election forecasts from 6 forecasting organizations. So I've chosen CNalysis, CNALYSIS, Cook Political Report, Inside Elections with Nathan Gonzalez, Larry Sabato's Crystal Ball, Split Ticket, and Elections Daily. Those aren't the only ones that are forecasting elections, but those are just some of the big ones that I chose to highlight here. So, competitive races that we'll be talking about are Arizona, Michigan, Montana, Nebraska, Nevada, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Texas, and Wisconsin. Now, Maryland is not seen as particularly competitive, but I am going to highlight it here as well, and I'll tell you why in a minute. But let's get into the specific states. And first up will be Arizona. So Arizona is expected to be a swing state for president. So that already adds to the competitiveness of the U.S. Senate race. How the presidential race shapes up will impact how the U.S. Senate race shapes up as well. Not necessarily that whichever party wins the presidency in Arizona will win the U.S. Senate race, There could be a difference there. Maybe Donald Trump will win the states, but Democrat Ruben Gallego might win the U.S. Senate. We'll have to see. But this one is an open seat. Democrat turned independent Kirsten Sinema declined to run for re-election, so it is an open seat. And that is Democrat Ruben Gallego versus Republican Kari Lake. Gallego served in the U.S. Marine Corps and won the U.S. House 3rd District in 2022. Lake is a former news anchor, and she's probably most well known for being a 2022 gubernatorial candidate, and she lost an extremely tight race to eventual winner, Democrat Katie Hobbs. That was within 1 point, meaning 1 percentage point difference between the two candidates. After Republicans won the U.S. Senate race in Arizona 9 straight times, Democrats have now won it the last 3 times. And Kari Lake has, at least for 2022 in particular, maybe less so this cycle, but she has tied herself to Donald Trump. So will that be a boon or a boost for her? We'll see. But Republican presidential candidates won the state from 2000 to 2016, so 5 straight times. But then Donald Trump lost it by less than 1 point in 2020. Some could argue that being affiliated with Donald Trump will help her out. Some will argue that it's not going to necessarily help her out. We'll have to see. But Gallego is very far ahead in campaign spending over Kari Lake. As of September 30th, 2024, Federal Election Commission numbers, Gallego's campaign committee spent $47.1 million. Lake spent only about $14.6 million. But the fact that this is still expected to be a close race is a good sign for Kari Lake. Gallego's campaign still has to spend that money wisely. Latest polls, according to Real Clear Politics, and that's where these polling numbers will be coming from. And then, of course, campaign spending numbers will be coming from the Federal Elections Commission, FEC. But latest poll, according to RCP, Gallego isn't leaving Lake in the dust, but he is further ahead against his Republican counterpart than a lot of other Dems in other states are doing against their Republican opponents in their own races. But several polls have him up about like 4 points. So I wouldn't say it's a comfortable lead, but it's a little bit more comfortable than a lot of Democrats have against their Republican opponents. But the latest voter registration numbers available, which are from July 2024, there's about 1.46 million Republicans in Arizona compared to 1.2 million Democrats, 1.4 million independents, and then you have some third-party members here and there. Not a whole lot of them. You usually don't see a whole lot of third-party affiliated voters in really most states. But Sabato's Crystal Ball and Cook Local Report in particular have it as competitive, but only slightly favoring Gallego. None of the organizations I highlighted here have Kari Lake as favored, but those two in particular, Sabato and Cook, see it as particularly competitive. Now on to Maryland. This is the one that I said was not expected to be competitive, but you may want to look out for it. So this is another open seat. Democrat Ben Cardin declined to seek re-election, and it's very easy to dismiss this one as very likely to stick with Democrats, which it certainly could. It's very likely to, because most Maryland races are won by Democrats. It's a deep blue state, but don't sleep on it, because Democrat Angela Alsobrooks is going up against Republican Larry Hogan. Now, Larry Hogan won the governorship in 2014 and 2018, which in Maryland history, Republicans almost never win the governorship. And not only that, he was one of the most popular governors, even as a Republican in a deep blue state. So if there's any Republican that can win a race in Maryland, it's probably him. And he's also one of the most prominent anti-Trump Republicans. He's made no bones about it. He is not a fan of Donald Trump. Even though Donald Trump endorsed him, Larry Hogan was not pleased with that and has said that he did not seek that endorsement and he does not want that endorsement, but he did endorse him. Now, it probably does help that he's distancing himself from Donald Trump in a deep blue state, but will it be enough to win? Probably not, but don't sleep on it. And also, Brooks is far ahead in overall spending compared to Larry Hogan. He has spent about $22.5 million. He spent about $8.7 million. You don't see a whole lot of independent expenditures in this race. There's about $800,000 more, give or take, that has favored Hogan versus also Brooks. But again, because it's not expected to be a particularly competitive race, you don't see a whole lot of independent expenditure activity in the state. And then latest voter registration numbers, about 2.2 million Democrats, 1 million Republicans, 907,000 that are unaffiliated, and then there's a small number of third party. Now, when say unaffiliated, some states call them just independent, some of them call them nonpartisan, some states call them unaffiliated or unenrolled. They all have their own different names for what you would consider a non-party voter. So they make up a large chunk of the electorate. Not necessarily that they're swing voters. There are still plenty that typically vote Republican or typically vote Democrat, but it is a hard obstacle for a Republican candidate to surmount, considering that they're doubled up, that the total number of Republican voters or Republican identified voters are doubled up by Democrats. And Inside Elections, Cook Political Report, and Sabato's Crystal Ball see it as slightly more competitive than other forecasters. The other forecasters see it as pretty much a done deal. So I would still say to keep a lookout for that, purely because Larry Hogan has won statewide before, although he's been out of office now, or out of the governor's office for a couple of years now. He was term limited, so he couldn't run for re-election back in 2022. So just be on the lookout for that. He might get smoked by Angela Alsobrooks, but I would say at least keep a little bit of an eye out on that one. Now, for Michigan, Michigan is another swing state for the presidency, and it's another open seat. This one is being vacated by Debbie Stabenow, who was the incumbent since she won in 2000 and then took office in 2001. This race is featuring Democrat Elisa Slotkin versus Republican Mike Rogers. Slotkin is the current representative of the very competitive 7th U.S. House District in Michigan, while Rogers was in the U.S. House from 2001 to 2015 for the 8th District, another competitive race. Democrats have won 9 straight U.S. Senate contests in Michigan, but the margin of victory has shrunk each time since 2008. And in 2020 for the other U.S. Senate seat, but it was 1.69 points. The margin of victory was 1.69 points in 2020. So it was very close there, and it's expected to be another close race for U.S. Senate in Michigan this year. But Slotkin is way ahead of Rogers in fundraising and campaign expenditures. She spent $36.7 million. Rogers has spent $7 million. So the fact that this is still competitive bodes well for Mike Rogers. I mean, you still have to spend the money wisely if you're Slotkin, but according to the latest polls on Real Clear Politics, a couple polls either have it at a tie or 1 point lead for Slotkin, but Quinnipiac has Slotkin up 8 points. Now, Quinnipiac is a well-respected pollster, but 8 points seems a bit much for this race. It could be something to do with their sampling, or Quinnipiac just happened to randomly get a Slotkin-leaning sample of voters. Now, I mean, it's still a random sampling, but just due to the nature of random sampling, maybe you happen to get a sample that heavily leans toward one candidate or the other. So all forecasters mentioned earlier give a slight edge to Slotkin, except Cook Political Report, which is calling it a flat-out toss-up. So definitely not a done deal in that state. And because it's a competitive state for president, that's inevitably going to affect the U.S. Senate race in some way. How much it will and whether there's a difference in which party wins the presidency, at least for that state, versus who wins, which party wins it for U.S. Senate, we'll have to see. There could be a difference there. now for Montana. So here is an interesting scenario where incumbent Democrat John Tester is running for re-election against Republican Tim Sheehy. It's a otherwise fairly Republican state, but Tester, who was first elected in 2006 and served in the Montana State Senate from 1999 to 2006, he is no stranger to competitive contests. He's won a bunch of competitive contests for U.S. Senate, and I'll get to that in just a moment. But Seehee is a Navy SEAL who founded a company called Bridger Aerospace, and he's also an active firefighting pilot. Now, Tester won by 3.5 points in 2018, 3.7 points in 2012, and 0.9 points in 2006. So he's won competitive races for this seat before. He could possibly do it again, although this one it'll be hard to do it a fourth time in a row, but we'll see. As for campaign spending, Tester blows Sheehy out of the water on fundraising and spending. John Tester has spent, or his campaign committee has spent $71 million, while Sheehy has spent $19.8 million. Independent expenditures, however, are more on Sheehy's side, but millions are being spent in favor of one candidate or the other, as opposed to just opposing one candidate. So it's definitely one to keep a lookout for. Latest polls, according to Real Clear Politics, there's only one poll that was showing up on RCP's website, and that was by the Hill/Emerson College. But that one has Sheehy up by 4 points. So interesting scenario there. So John Tester's time in Montana as the U.S. Senator might have run out now, but we'll have to see. He might be able to pull off another close victory. And all the aforementioned forecasters give a slight edge to Sheehy, which would flip party control of the seat. Now we move on to Nebraska. This one is a very curious situation where there is no Democratic candidate, but independent Dan Osborne is making things very competitive with the incumbent Republican Deb Fischer. Osborne is polling well, though have to see how much that bears out in voting. Independents in elections often poll far better than what their ultimate share of the vote is, because people often like to say that they want independents and third-party winners, and they want them to be more competitive, but they ultimately often choose the quote-unquote lesser of two evils between Democrats and Republicans. But that is more so the case when you have both a Democrat and a Republican. There is no Democrat in this election. It's just a Republican. So that could bode particularly well for independent Dan Osborne. Now, Republicans have tried tying Osborne to Democrats, and Nebraska is a generally pretty red state, but he has said that he will not caucus with either Democrats or Republicans or take endorsements from either of the parties, but he did have talks with the state's Democratic Party where the party decided that they would not run a candidate afterward. So depending on your point of view, some might say that was collaboration with the Democratic Party in that state. Others might say they just decided to cut their losses and try to get an independent in as opposed to run a Democrat who was very unlikely to win. Now, as for campaign spending, as of, again, September 30th, 2024, Fisher's campaign spent about $7 million, whereas Osborne's has spent $4.25 million. So not necessarily the most comparable of spending, amounts of spending by the campaign committees, although much more competitive in that regard than a lot of these other states on this list. But Osborne is in the thick of it. And when we look at voter registration numbers as of October 1st, 2024, we have about 614,000 Republicans, 334,000 Democrats, 274,000 no party affiliates. So at first glance, you might look at it and say, oh, well, if you just combine the MPAs, no party affiliates, and Democrats, that's a comparable number to Republicans. But just being a non-party affiliate, it doesn't inherently mean that you're predisposed to vote independent. Like I said before, a lot of people say that they're going to vote independent, or that they want to, but ultimately don't. So it's not necessarily a base for Osborne to draw from, but he is keeping things competitive. The latest poll, according to Real Clear Politics, there's only one poll that was showing on their website, but that one says that Fisher is up by only 2 points, and that was according to a joint poll by the New York Times and Siena College. So Fisher is definitely in the thick of things. So the seat might be a flip, but not towards Democrats. It might be a flip to an independent. And Inside Elections and Cook Political Report particularly see this race as competitive, only slightly favoring Fisher. So one of the really interesting ones, I mean, these are all interesting, but that one in particular, just because of a competitive independent, is one to really look out for. On to Nevada, or Nevada, depending on who you ask. Another swing state for president. This one features income Democrat Jackie Rosen versus Republican Sam Brown. Rosen won in 2018, and before that was a one-term U.S. House representative. Sam Brown was a U.S. Army captain who was wounded in an IED explosion, and that one is another particularly competitive race. The campaign spending, according to the FEC, Rosen has spent $39.4 million, whereas Brown has spent $14.3 million. But there has been a ton of independent expenditure money spent in opposition to Sam Brown. So that spending gap in terms of campaign spending, when you account for both Jackie Rosen's campaign committee and independent expenditures, really widens that gulf between the pro Jackie Rosen side and the pro Sam Brown side. Latest voter registration statistics as of October 1st, 2024, it's about 719,000 Democrats, 674,000 Republicans, 825,000 no party affiliates, and then there's 108,000 people that identify with the Independent American Party. And then there's some other third-party voters there. And this is including both inactive and active voters. Some states have a delineation between an active voter and an inactive voter. Now, how each state considers each one of them, what their exact definitions differ, but generally speaking, an active voter is one who is a much more regular participant in elections, while an inactive voter just participates a lot less regularly. And there is some debate as to whether we should have a group of voters designated as inactive. This isn't the episode to get into that, but this is just assuming that all of these voters I'm just including both groups in here just for the sake of simplicity. Latest polls, according to RCP, have Rosen with a similar lead over her Republican opponent, in this case, Sam Brown, that Gallego in Arizona has over Lake, which is about 4 points. So Jackie Rosen still is generally expected to keep the seat, although it's definitely going to be a fight. The aforementioned forecasters that we talked about at the beginning all give the edge to Rosen, but Sabato's crystal ball and the Cook Political Report see it as a particularly competitive election. Now, on to Ohio. If there's any single U.S. Senate race that could be considered the one to watch, it's going to be this one. This one is incumbent Democrat Sherrod Brown versus Republican Bernie Moreno. So Brown has served in the seat since 2007, first won in 2006, and was a U.S. House rep before that from 1993 to 2007. So he's been in Congress for a very long time for Ohio and has seen it become progressively more Republican. And Moreno is a Colombian-born entrepreneur. And Moreno also highlights endorsements from a lot of big-name elected Republicans, including Donald Trump, J.D. Vance, Jim Jordan, Kristi Noem, who's the South Dakota governor, Vivek Ramaswamy, if I remember correctly, that's actually how you pronounce it, Terry Lake over in Arizona, lots of other big-name elected Republicans he counts as endorsements. So he's clearly tied his wagon, so to speak, to the big names in the party. So we'll see how well that works out for him in a increasingly Republican state who has still at times voted Democrat or for what you would expect as a more Democrat policy. For example, their abortion amendment they voted for in 2023, they approved it. And Sherrod Brown has still won elections as a Democrat in Ohio. So we'll see if he's able to do it again. But the campaign spending numbers, this is one of, if not the widest gulf we see on this list. Sherrod Brown's campaign committee has spent $80.4 million, and Bernie Moreno's has spent $19 million. And there's been a lot of independent expenditures dumped into this race as well, including over $20 million spent in favor of Moreno. So closes the gap a little bit. Still a pretty wide gap, but a little less wide than it would have been without those independent expenditures. Now, Ohio does not track voter registration numbers, but based on voting for most offices, president, governor, U.S. House, state legislature, the other U.S. Senate seat, over the past decade, there's a clear Republican lean. So I would expect there to be a fairly, not necessarily a huge number more Republicans than there are Democrats, but a pretty decent advantage there, for lack of a better term. As for election ratings, like I said, this one is probably the one to watch because all those election forecasters I mentioned earlier, they all agree this one is a flat-out toss-up. Who knows what's going to happen? This one could be within 1 point, a 1 point margin of victory. This one could very well go into a recount. Obviously, we'll have to see when the election is actually held, but this one is going to be a very tight one. So buckle up, especially if you're an Ohio voter. Now to Pennsylvania, the Keystone State, another swing state for president. This one features incumbent Democrat Bob Casey Jr. versus Republican David McCormick. Casey has been in the U.S. Senate since first winning his seat in 2006, and he was also the state treasurer and auditor before then. So well known in Pennsylvania political circles. McCormick was in the U.S. Army during the Gulf War. He's also been a business CEO, and he worked in the U.S. government, including as a security advisor. Pennsylvania has had several pretty high-profile races as of late, although in 2022, Democrats for U.S. Senate and governor won pretty handily in their races, or at least they weren't particularly close. As for the campaign spending for this U.S. Senate race, Casey has spent $45.4 million. McCormick's has spent $26 million. So a little bit more of or not quite as wide of a gap as some of these other states, but millions and millions of dollars in independent expenditures, particularly in support of or in opposition to McCormick, have been spent in this race as well. So McCormick is the subject of a lot of independent expenditures, whether they favor him or not. Latest voter registration numbers for Pennsylvania, which are updated weekly, there are 3.97 million Democrats, 3.67 million Republicans, 1.1 million non-party affiliates, and then some other third-party voters. So a little bit more in favor of Democrats, but by no means they are certainly not well ahead of Republicans in total number of registered voters. But the latest polls, according to Real Clear Politics, neither candidate is more than 1 point ahead in the polls. And all forecasters mentioned give a slight edge to Bob Casey, except Cook Political Report, which is calling it a flat-out toss-up. Cook has more states rated as a toss-up than the other forecasters on this list do. Now for Texas, which is maybe with the exception of Maryland, maybe the least competitive state on the list, or at least expected to be the least competitive, but still more than what you would expect for Texas. This one is incumbent Republican Ted Cruz versus Democrat Colin Allred. Cruz, probably one of the more well-known Republicans nationally. Cruz won back in 2012 and 2018. He also ran for president in 2016. and his U.S. Senate race in 2018, he defeated Beto O'Rourke in what was, at the time, the most expensive congressional race in U.S. history. And Ted Cruz only won by about 2.6 points in 2018 compared to 15.9 points in 2012. So that's a big part of why this race is expected to be closer. And Allred is a 3-term U.S. House incumbent. Previously, he played in the NFL for the Tennessee Titans. I believe he was a linebacker. And he also served in the Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD for short, under the Obama administration. FEC spending has them as actually pretty comparable. Overall, technically favors Ted Cruz. Now, Ted Cruz has spent $62.9 million, while Allred, his campaign, has spent $65.4 million, but Cruz has a lot more cash on hand, about $10 million more cash on hand. So he still has a bunch more in the tank, and I think Allred's is something like $3.5 million cash on hand. And the independent expenditures are much more on Ted Cruz's side. The latest polls, according to Real Clear Politics, give Cruz a slight edge, maybe certainly not a comfortable edge, but not one where it's super neck and neck. But Cruz still has a lot of work to do. As for which forecasters see it as particularly competitive, that would be CNanalysis, Cook Political Report, and Split Ticket. They all see it as only slightly favoring Ted Cruz. All these forecasters see it Cruz with the advantage, but those ones see it as only slightly favoring him, as more competitive than the other forecasters see it. And then for the final state on this list, it's Wisconsin, which is another swing state for president. So however the state votes for presidents between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris is going to have a major impact on the U.S. Senate race. Now, whether how much it's going to decide the race, we'll obviously have to see. But this one features incumbent Democrat Tammy Baldwin versus Republican Eric Hovde. Baldwin won in 2012 and 2018, and before that, she was in the U.S. House from 1999 to 2013. Hovde is an entrepreneur who ran in 2012. He lost in the Republican primary to Tommy Thompson, who then ultimately lost to Baldwin in her first U.S. Senate victory. So kind of full circle, I guess. Now, when it comes to election spending, that favors Tammy Baldwin. Baldwin's committee has spent $42.4 million, whereas Hovde's campaign committee has spent about $25.9 million. And there's been millions and millions of dollars in independent expenditures being spent on the race, primarily in opposition to either Baldwin or Hovde, especially Hovde. But most of the independent expenditures have not been in support of one. It's more in opposition to one of the candidates. And this is a pretty purple state in who it elects. Purple meaning blue typically is Democrat, red's typically Republican. If it has a mix of both, we call it purple. So purple states in who it elects. The other U.S. Senate seat is Republican, while this one is Democrat. The state legislature has a pretty heavy lean towards Republicans. The governor is a second-term Democrat, and the Secretary of State and Attorney General are also Democrat. And then the U.S. House delegation leans Republican. So the more districted offices typically are Republican, whereas the statewide offices are typically Democrat. And then the latest polls, according to Real Clear Politics, have this as very neck and neck, perhaps slightly favoring Baldwin. And all forecasters except for one give the slightest of edges to Baldwin, that exception being Cook Political Report, which sees it as a flat-out toss-up. So that's going to do it for the U.S. Senate races. But just like last episode, it's not going to be a random question today. I'm going to have that saved for the end of this string of episodes. But as always, thank you so much for listening to the episode. And you can find me on Facebook, LinkedIn, Medium. I'll have more of the information in the show notes as always. And we'll cover the competitive U.S. House races as well as governor and state legislative chamber control. And then, of course, the presidency later on this week. So once again, obviously, As always, thank you so much for listening. And until next time, take care.